Today's Zoom briefing is going to be diving into the issue of assisted suicide, also known as assisted dying, which a lot of you will realize obviously is kind of shot to prominence in recent weeks. My name is Tim. I'm a freelance religion journalist, and I'm really pleased to introduce our panel of speakers and experts and commentators for this week. We have Jonathan Romain. Jonathan is a writer, broadcaster, and a rabbi at Maidenhead Synagogue, and he's the co-founder of a new coalition of faith leaders in favor of assisted dying. We also have Liz Slade. Liz is the Chief Executive Officer of the Unitarians. Also pleased to welcome Sarah Foote, who's a palliative care doctor and a member of the Christian Medical Fellowship. And we also have Hina Shahid, who's a GP and a chair of the Muslim Doctors Association. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Just so everyone has a rough idea of where we're going, I'm going to chair a discussion among our panelists for about 35, 40 minutes or so. And then the final 15 minutes we'll take questions from those who've joined us today. So if you think of something interesting you'd like to pick up on or a question to ask, do make a note of it while we're talking. And then you can either pop that in the chat box or wave at me at the right moment, and we can come and you can ask your question directly. As I said, today we're going to be looking at assisted suicide, but in particular we want to zoom in on the religious arguments for and against, and what place religion and faith plays in this debate. To kind of set the scene, as I think probably most of you will know, Baroness Meacher has introduced a new bill to the House of Lords, which, if passed, would allow terminally ill patients who have less than 6 months to live to be given lethal drugs by a doctor to end their own lives. This has prompted, obviously, lots of debate. Just yesterday, in fact, the British Medical Association voted to switch its stance on assisted dying to neutral, having previously been opposed. It was actually a real knife-edge vote, so they had 49% of the doctors voted to move to neutrality, 48% voted they wanted to stay opposed, and 3% abstained. But I think the interesting aspect that we want to dig in today is the religious one. And as has long been the case on this question, some of the most prominent voices that argue against euthanasia and assisted suicide have come from faith communities. But there is now also a movement in favor of reform from a specifically faith-based perspective. And as some of you might have seen, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, and Jonathan here wrote a piece in the British Medical Journal just last week, I believe, about this new coalition that they've pulled together, arguing in favor of assisted dying. And among kind of the names backing them it was the very famous Nobel Peace Prize winning former Archbishop of Cape Town, Desmond Tutu. I wanted to just read out one quote just to set the scene here from their piece in the BMJ. So this is Jonathan and George Carey wrote this: "If the religious ideal is to imitate God's ways, then it is our duty to use our God-given abilities as much as possible. We could argue, therefore, that assisted dying is part of the constant act of playing God, in the sense that God wants us to help people in distress, to heal where possible, to comfort when needed, and to help let go of life when desired. This is what being religious means." I wanted to start by asking you, Jonathan, it's quite striking to hear religious arguments levied in favor rather than in opposition to assisted suicide. Why did you want to write this piece, and kind of why have you pulled together this religious alliance in favor of changing the law?
This came from years of practical experience as a congregational minister and seeing people die in hospital or hospices and dying in pain. And needlessly so, because they wanted to let go before, without having to struggle for those extra few weeks and months. And of course, there are some people who do want to carry on to their last breath. And of course, we all know that hospital staff and hospices do wonderful work, but there are certain pains that they cannot control. And people who've got cancer, motor neuron, Parkinson's, all these often have really terrible ends. And if they are dying anyway, and if they want to let go, and if it's of their own free will, then in whose interest are we forcing them to stay alive? And by the way, that's why we call it assisted dying, rather than suicide, because suicide is associated with people who often, if they hadn't committed suicide, could have lived on a long and healthy life for many years to come. Assisted dying is only for those people who are terminally ill. And the other slight correction, if you don't mind, is that margin of 49-48 was actually only amongst the representatives there. In the survey that the BMA had done amongst the doctors, there was 61% in favour either of changing the law or staying neutral. So actually the membership was a much, much broader wave of support for changing the legislation, and certainly for the doctors to move to a position of neutrality.
Are there distinct arguments in favour of assisted dying which are specific from theology, from faith, separate to those you might hear put forward by kind of secular advocates in some of the lobby groups, do you think?
Not particularly, because, to be honest with you, the Bible and rabbinic or Christian teachings never really dealt with this situation. It's a modern issue because people are living longer, which is great, but they're not necessarily living better. And we're used to people controlling their lives, and we want people to have as good a life as possible. So why should they not also have as good a death as possible? And there's nothing, as I said in the article, nothing sacred about suffering. There's nothing holy about agony. And if we can do it in a gentle way, and with those three crucial conditions, which, by the way, are in the Meacher bill, of one, they have to be terminally ill, they have to be mentally competent, and it has to be of their own free will. And it's a matter of compassion. And compassion is, yes, it's a religious value, and it's a value hopefully even the non-religious will also have.
Hina, how do you respond when you hear people arguing on the basis of not just kind of compassion, but their specifically religious faith for assisted dying, assisted suicide? Does that concern you or surprise you to see that their opinion is divided among those kind of religious backgrounds?
In the Islamic faith, it is quite clear, and it's mentioned in the Quran, where God says, "Do not kill yourselves, for verily God has been to you most merciful." And there are lots of teachings in the Quran and also in kind of narrations of the Prophet Muhammad, where we are explicitly told about about recognizing and valuing the sanctity of life for ourselves and for other people, and suicide is prohibited across the board and across denominations within Islamic law. So Islam is quite clear on the issue of suicide. When we're talking about assisted dying or assisted suicide, again, the same principles apply. So life is a gift from God, and we respect life, and it is also for God to decide when our appointed time is. So that is the mainstream Islamic argument. Now, of course, when we talk about compassion and we talk about autonomy, then there are crossovers between other religions and secular thought as well. And I'm sure you'll be touching upon this because these are really complex issues. And unfortunately, what we see is that some of these terms like compassion and dignity and autonomy are used in ways to favor assisted dying and assisted suicide, whereas in fact we're completely ignoring other options and alternative viewpoints.
Liz, I wanted to come to you and ask you, what's your kind of perspective on this? Do you think there is a specifically Unitarian perspective on assisted dying, or something that is unique to those of a faith background, that arguments or perspectives that wouldn't be put forward by secular advocates?
Yeah, just because Unitarianism can be a bit of a well-kept secret sometimes, just to kind of give a little bit of background on where we come from generally is, it comes from a liberal Christian background, but Unitarians have all sorts of different faith beliefs, and really that's at the core of Unitarianism, is the right to seek truth and meaning for ourselves, and to be guided by our own intuition and conscience. And so there's a very varied perspective within the Unitarian movement, and so it feels hard to differentiate between religious and non-religious from a Unitarian perspective, because our membership is so varied in perspective and belief. But really that wish to be guided by conscience is, I think, what's key in the questions around assisted dying is that obviously at the moment the law prevents people from acting according to their conscience if they were to wish for assisted dying, if they were terminally ill. And so Unitarians voted, the membership voted back in 2013 in support of assisted dying because of debilitating or incurable physical conditions. And that's really to reflect the dignity and worth of all people and the freedom for them to believe as their conscience dictates. So really what we're interested in, I think, is that freedom of conscience to be able to choose. Not that we would wish to impose any of that on anyone else. That's a very important Unitarian perspective, is to respect others' beliefs, but really to have the freedom of our own belief and conscience, knowing that that will be quite varied within the Unitarian movement itself.
Sarah, let's come to you next. Do you think there is a consensus position among Christians, or now we're seeing people like George Carey, who knows, far from being a liberal, is kind of associated with the evangelical movement, saying that he's changed his mind? Do you think there is a growing shift among Christians who have previously been quite staunchly opposed to changing their view on this?
Thanks for having me here today, Tim. I think in any large group of people, you will always have differences of opinion, and we know that the church has many different branches, and we can differ slightly in our views. I'm not seeing a shift, though. I think there have always been people who have a different view, but I think there's still a lot of consensus among Christians. And I think there's a lot of consensus among Christian doctors, and that's that we look, that we are, so the kind of religious Christian arguments are that we are made in God's image. Christians see in the Bible in Genesis that we are made in God's image and we are truly special, wonderful beings, and that we reflect God. And we're also called to love each other. And we talk about compassion, and a really important thing in these arguments, both when debating in the public square, but also when looking after friends, relatives, members of our church family, is compassion for other suffering. And I certainly have compassion for those who are pro-assisted dying. They have fears around suffering, fear of dying, and wants and needs. But I think from a Christian point of view, we are called to live in community, that being dependent on others and being a burden to others is actually can be a really good thing. That there are times in our lives when we are completely dependent on others, when we're babies, when we're unwell, as we come towards the end of our lives, and then times in our lives when we're able to help others more easily, as Christians, when we serve in our communities and in our churches. And I think in this day and age, sometimes there's more focus on the point in our lives when we can help and serve others. But actually, it's a form of serving others to be served, to allow people to help you, and it can be a real opportunity. And we're also creative and imaginative beings. You know, our God created this incredible world, all the plants, all the animals, and he was wonderfully imaginative. And I think a real calling on Christians is to be imaginative in our care of those who are dying. And we look at the hospice movement. So I'm a palliative medicine doctor, so I care for those at the end of their lives. And this is where there is a crossover in the kind of Christian and religious arguments, is that, you know, there is an alternative way. There is an alternative way to suffering, or to ending one's life with assisted dying. And that's the kind of compassionate care of the hospice movement, of finding alternative ways to ease people's suffering by coming alongside people And I think that also reflects Jonathan mentioned the debate yesterday. I took part in it in the BMA, and a big part of the questionnaire that went out to the BMA members was that palliative doctors, those of us who actually our day-to-day job is caring for those who are dying, we were the ones that were most strongly against assisted dying. Almost it was around 90%. I haven't got the exact figure, and that is, I think, because we have that lived experience of finding that alternative way, that imaginative, compassionate way of caring.
It's interesting that you're someone who has, as you said, has a bit of foot in both camps. You're a palliative care doctor and also a Christian. Do you think this is fundamentally a question of ethics and values and morals, or is this fundamentally a kind of healthcare policy question for you?
That's a really tough question. I think my morals and my ethics are driven by my religious background, and I think every single doctor, whether they have a particular religion or not, will have things in their life that drives their beliefs and drives how we act. And we all have our GMC rules. We all want to help patients. So I guess I come from that background. But then in the secular world of being a doctor, of working in the NHS, of caring for patients, it's then a policy thing where I believe that assisted dying will, whilst I personally don't want it, I wouldn't want to take part in it, I also care about my vulnerable patients, and I worry that a change in the law, whilst giving autonomy to those who want assisted dying, will take away the autonomy of those who are very vulnerable, who there's the kind of the spoken and the unspoken burdens that people can feel, that the fears. So they worry that they're a burden on their family, and so often we're really bad at communicating as doctors with patients and patients with families. I see it day in, day out, that I worry that patients will kind of feel coerced into assisted dying, no matter how hard we try not to.
Jonathan, could I ask you the same question? Do you think this is fundamentally a debate about ethics, theology, morals, or is this actually should it be focused on a more grounded questions of patient autonomy, healthcare policy, that kind of thing?
Yes, it's all hopelessly mixed up, and I'm not really sure if it matters, to be honest. The point is, what happens to individuals, and are they dying in pain? Are they dying in the way they want to? Because, to pick up a couple of points that Sarah said, she talked about being imaginative, which I agree with, and part of that for me means not being dogmatic, so that person, that Sarah, for instance, can choose what she wants to do, but that shouldn't stop somebody else choosing what they want to do, because it's their death, and they may want to do it in a different way. So I think we need to give people that freedom, that autonomy. And also the thing about palliative care, and I'm a great supporter of palliative care, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing that the doctors and nurses do there. But it's really interesting what's happened in Oregon, where this system that's being proposed in Britain has actually been in operation for the last 25 years. I should say, by the way, that there are other systems elsewhere in the world, like in Holland and Belgium, which have a very, very different rules, and which really aren't worth comparing to. But with Oregon, it's virtually the same system. And what's fascinating is that the palliative care doctors and nurses were passionately against the introduction of assisted dying when it was being debated and before it came into practice. But now that it's happened, now that it's a reality, they work together fabulously and very well. And in fact, if you ask them, they will say that they have benefited because there's much more attention now given to end of life care. It's an area that people, perhaps apart from those on this webinar, sort of tend to be rather reticent about. They don't like talking about death, but it's really, really brought it to the fore, and actually it's brought much more interest and much more investment in palliative care, because that is one of the options, and we tend not to talk about the different options, and there should be a whole range for those who so wish.
And can I ask you also about something specifically about the Jewish community? Is it fair to say that your perspective is perhaps a minority among British Jews? I know that most of the Orthodox denominations have come out quite strongly against this. Do you find yourself having to persuade a lot of your fellow Jews of the case for it?
Two really interesting things about that. Firstly, is I am a minority amongst rabbis. That's certainly true. But I'm not a minority amongst Jews, because there was a fascinating poll that came out, I think it was last year, which showed that 82% of people of faith are in favor. And by people of faith, it wasn't just like vague belief. These were people who went to church, synagogue, mosque, gurdwara at least once a month. In other words, who actually turned up and went to their religious building. I mean, time and time again, you know, I've spoken at meetings up and down the country, and people have put this argument forward and that argument forward and against, and, you know, and at the end of the day, I've said, okay, I accept what you're saying, but if it was you, if it was actually you who had this awful terminal disease, would you want that option for yourself? And, you know, every hand in the room goes up. They want that option for themselves. So if they want it for themselves, why shouldn't other people have that right too?
Liz, you talked earlier about the importance for Unitarians about freedom of conscience and kind of individuals being able to choose their own paths. I know you're here kind of speaking in a personal capacity, but would you like to see the Unitarian movement, community such as it is, kind of corporately weigh in on this issue? Is it important enough that people are given the chance by changing the law that you think as a denomination, as a group, you should weigh in and start lobbying Parliament on this?
That's a very difficult one for the type of movement that we are, which is very much a kind of grassroots bottom up. So with my role, if there was that wish emerging from the movement, then I would, you know, it's my responsibility to support and encourage that, rather than, you know, we're not the kind of, you know, we're very non-hierarchical and decentralized. And so having that sort of central view can be, you know, can be difficult. But, you know, to have that sort of unified perspective. But I think it is really important to have more sort of diverse views, and particularly recognizing that a lot of people in Britain today, their spiritual or religious perspectives aren't so neatly matched to traditional religious groups as perhaps they have been in the past. And I think that's something that Unitarians can really help to express, is to show that, you know, people may, you know, identify as, you know, as Unitarian, but have a Christian perspective or a pagan perspective, or, you know, a Buddhist perspective, but still belong to this broader faith, or to be agnostic or atheist or humanist within that. And I think that that richness of different spiritual perspectives is really important to bring to this conversation, because that is representative of the majority of Britain today, where a lot of people don't identify as religious, but still have spiritual needs. And these are particularly important when it comes to end-of-life care, and even more so in the sort of assisted dying conversations, where people need to have that kind of spiritual support that may be quite hard to access if they're not part of a traditional faith group.
That's really interesting, because I wanted to ask about that as well. Just, this is to the whole panel, whoever wants to come in. Do you think, you know, obviously we all know that the great British public today tend not to be particularly religious. You know, affiliation and attendance at religious services has been declining for decades. Do you think people will be moved by arguments from faith, by arguments drawing on ethics and theology? Do you think there is a place for Christians or the Church of England or the Chief Rabbi's office or whoever it is to weigh in and attempt to sway people either way? That's open to anyone who wants to jump in on that. Sarah?
I think there can be a place for it. I think when you're certainly in the medical sphere, we tend to focus on the medical arguments that, you know, assisted dying will put vulnerable patients at risk, and it can take away resources from palliative care, and it can damage the doctor-patient relationship, because there's that fundamental here that doctors are here to benefit rather than take away. But I also think there is, yes, attendance at church is declining, but as a palliative care doctor, I think Liz was saying about meeting spiritual needs, and as part of good palliative care, we, and it's almost like a compulsory question in my hospital, we must be asking people if they have any spiritual needs that we can help meet. And you know, that can have a really wide-ranging set of answers. You know, you could have someone who's a Catholic who wants a Catholic priest to come and see them, to someone who has less kind of traditional religious views, but they want some help with various things, someone being with them, someone just holding their hand. You know, the spiritual aspect can be really quite wide. I think there is still a place for religious leaders. They're often very trusted, so people want to hear what their opinion is to help inform their opinion.
Hina, I wanted to ask you a kind of similar question. As a GP, you must obviously spend some time with people, elderly people with chronic conditions who might be thinking about the end of their life. Do you think that the kind of spiritual aspect, even a religious aspect, is an important part of that and an important part of your job as a doctor?
So I also just forget to add that as part of my GP role, I have been doing for the past several years a weekly palliative care clinic. So my role is actually going out into patient homes for those who are terminally ill, and having discussions around end-of-life care with them. And actually what we do know is that, and even just reflecting on my own discussions, is that the spiritual dimension is quite important. And when we're talking about the spiritual dimension, it's not just about your religious beliefs, it's about what gives your life meaning and purpose. You know, in those last stages, you know, what is it that they have hopes and aspirations for? So that comes under the spiritual dimension. It's not just about religion. And so, you know, the spiritual dimension, ethics are very deeply intertwined with end-of-life care. I did want to just pick up on a few points that were raised earlier. So, you know, there was discussion around around pain, and that patients at the end of life suffer excruciating pain, and that may be a reason why they want to end their life. And actually, that isn't what the data shows. The data, you know, which we have from several countries now, shows that actually the majority of the reasons why patients want to end their life, or or ask their physicians to end their life, is not because of physical pain, but it's because of emotional pain. So depression, loneliness, a feeling that they're a burden. So all these social issues, existential pain as well. So it's not actually physical pain. And the UK has the best palliative care system in the world. Out of 80 countries, it's consistently ranked as the highest, and most effective palliative care system. So we do need to remember that in this country, we do have that. And I have seen firsthand the impact that good palliative care makes to patients at the end of life when we have that holistic approach, where we don't just give medications to ease symptoms like physical pain or agitation, but also make sure that patients are adequately supported mentally and socially, as well as spiritually. So it's having that whole holistic approach. And my worry is that when assisted suicide, or if it's legalized, that it will distract attention away from all these other sources of support and assessment that are so vital in looking after patients at the end of their life. What we also know from Oregon is that and this is actually quite concerning. There was a study that was done, I think it was around 2008. It was a relatively small study, but it looked at patients who had who had gone through physician-assisted suicide, and found that 1 in 6 had undiagnosed depression. And if you look at the 2019 report for Oregon, actually only 1% to 0.5% were referred for a psychiatric assessment. So there are real issues with safeguards not being in place, and we need to remember that. We may have 25 years of data, but we need to really look at that data. That data may show us things like demographics, what the ages of people who are going ahead with physician-assisted suicide, but it doesn't tell us anything about how many consultations are these patients having with their doctors? How long are those consultations for? Who else is being consulted? Are relatives being consulted? There are all these unknowns. I don't accept that we have this data for 25 years that we should feel confident with in adopting in the UK.
Liz or Jonathan, would you like to respond to anything you've heard there, particularly this question about whether palliative care is under threat or is at risk if we legalise assisted dying?
Yeah, I've just, it feels important to sort of recognise that as a society in Britain today, we're not great at talking about death generally. And I think that there is a role, a responsibility of religious, spiritual leaders from all sorts of different backgrounds to be part of shifting that culture so that we can have healthier conversations about death, of all types at all points in life, for individuals, for their families. And it feels like that is an important part of this whole conversation, the whole context. And as Sarah and Hina have said, there's the NHS is incredible and is doing the things that are already happening in palliative care certainly shouldn't be overlooked or anything like that. But even with how strong they are and the questions around people's spiritual needs that do already happen at the end of life, there's still such a long way to go, I feel, in people being able to have healthy conversations about the end of life with their families, with their healthcare providers, with the people who are important to them in their lives, so that we can all be better equipped to navigate these things. And it doesn't need to feel sort of narrow or polarized or separated into kind of individual versus religious versus policy versus what the data says. I think there's a general need for richer, more nuanced, more caring, more sophisticated conversations about death in our culture generally. And I see that would enable us to see, okay, let's look at what's been happening in Oregon. Let's understand the differences. Let's look at what's happening already in the UK. Let's understand the strengths. Let's understand the gaps that are being felt by individuals, by people in the NHS, by religious leaders, and just have a much richer conversation that involves people from all walks of life. That's what I'd like to see happening.
Yes, I certainly endorse all of that. And to pick up some particular points mentioned earlier, I mean, Hina is right that not everybody who goes to Oregon or Dignitas is just because of pain. It could be also indignity. In other words, they've got MS or MND, and they don't want to, people who've led a very healthy, busy, active life don't want to be in a situation where they can't move their limbs, they are spoon-fed or whatever. And they say, look, I'd like to go before that stage. And it feels almost sort of arrogant to say, no, you've got to get to that awful, awful stage because that's what you've got to do. So, there are many reasons why people who are terminally ill, and that's so critical, go for assisted dying. That's correct. As for the religion and the doctors changing their minds, it is significant. I mean, people do want to discuss these issues, as Liz has just said, and particularly when they're approaching the sort of the end of their life. And they know, people are pretty savvy about what their minister of faith is going to take attitude. I mean, they know if they want an abortion, they can't really talk to a Catholic priest, so they know that. But so it's really important that if they do want to talk about death, that they can talk to their priest, their bishop, their rabbi, whatever, about that issue. I think what's happened now is that, yes, there's always been ministers of faith who've been in favor of assisted dying, or sympathetic to it at least, but there's been this sort of almost three-line whip from the top. But now people are actually beginning to speak up, they're sort of coming out, if you like, and we've got bishops, priests, imams, rabbis, vicars saying, well, actually, I do think there is something that we need to talk about here. And that's really encouraging because it means their parishioners can talk about it. Whilst as for doctors, I'm not sure if it's going to affect detrimentally the doctor-patient relationship. You could argue that it would actually affect it beneficially, because the constant cry I hear when visiting families or individuals is, doctor, can't you do anything about this? Doctor, can't you help? And if the doctor can say, well, look, there are different options you've got. There's palliative care, there's assisted dying, there's this, there's that. Then that is actually much more helpful. So I don't see any problem with doctor-patient relationship. In fact, it'll become more honest and more open.
Sarah, do you worry that if the law was changed, you would be obliged to kind of refer people and take part in a system of assisted dying that kind of contradicted your deeply held religious beliefs?
I guess it's always a fear, but yesterday some of the non-headline news from the BMA was, for example, passing a motion around conscientious objection, that actually supporting doctors in being able to follow their conscience is really important, because when people don't, they suffer from moral injury, and that impacts them as a doctor, it impacts their ability to provide patient care. I think there is, my understanding is that there is support amongst medical profession, both religious and non-religious, for conscientious rights to be protected in any new law. That doesn't mean it definitely will be, and it will certainly remain to be seen. And I think in terms of it, I just wanted to pick on what Jonathan said about the doctor-patient relationship. Also the sort of people who are able to access assisted dying. So from the doctor-patient relationship point of view, if say as a doctor, I'm happy to offer it, and we're always obliged as doctors to make sure patients know their options. And for example, I was talking to a patient who is coming towards the end of their life. It's a little unexpected. And we were talking about options around feeding for him as he comes towards the end of his life. And essentially there were two options available, and it took an hour talking through these different options to try and work out what's best for him and his family. But then there could, if we bring in assisted dying, there'll always be that third option where, well, you don't have to do this, and then there's assisted dying. And at the point where we need to always be, we must tell people about their available options, then it can really damage the relationship, because we as doctors, we as humans really struggle with these conversations around dying. Even us as palliative care doctors really struggle. And I really appreciated Liz bringing that up, because she's completely right. We need to be talking about it more. And I would love to see churches talking about dying more, because we as doctors have traditionally medicalised dying, and we've taken it out of the home, we've taken it away from families, we've put it behind closed doors, and we give lots of drugs. And people don't know what dying involves. They don't see it, and they can. I'm constantly have patients of relatives who are surprised at how peaceful the process can be. We need to be having more discussions about our wants and our expectations and our hopes and fears. And so I think it has the potential to really damage. And then we also have the problem of fairness, that there's real justice issues here, which are really, again, at the core of Christianity. Again, Liz said we had world-leading hospice and palliative care, and she's completely right, except our world-leading care is nowhere near as good as it should be. Our hospices are actually in crisis at the moment because they aren't funded properly. As a colleague of mine said, they're funded by bake sales and goodwill. We have a second-hand bookstall outside our office where anyone can come up and buy a book at any time for 50p. That really needs to change. And actually, again, not in headline news yesterday, the BMA passed another motion about how we really, really need to be prioritising funding of palliative care so that everyone has access to it in the UK. It's not just middle-class people living in middle-class areas where there are well-funded hospices, which can be the problem. And then with assisted dying, if we bring it in, then surely it should be available to everyone, if that's the case, just as we want the hospices and good palliative care to be available to everyone. Assisted dying needs to be available to everyone. And so if you've only got 6 months to live and you can benefit from it, well, what about if you've got 7 months to live? That's not very fair. Or what about if you've got MS and you don't have 6 months to live, but you've got many years of what you consider intractable suffering? Then it's not available to you. And so that really, again, conflicts with the Christian faith and other faiths, I'm sure, about justice and everyone having access.
We're coming to the end where I'm going to shortly throw it open to our audience to ask some questions. So if you have something you'd like to write, please either put it in the chat, you can send it to me, or just start thinking about something you'd like to write. Just wanted to come to Hina as another doctor. Do you have any thoughts on what impact assisted dying, if it was legislated through, would have on your patient kind of doctor relationships?
Sure. So I think Sarah's put it all really well. And just to echo and build on some of the points that she raised, I mean, the first one is that, I agree when she said, the relatives are often surprised by how peaceful the dying process is, and certainly that has been my experience of caring for patients who have died at home. That points to that anticipatory fear around death and dying, which, if adequately explored, and the concerns are met holistically, as I mentioned, then, it does become a peaceful process. It doesn't have to be that painful, agitating process that there's that common perception around. Secondly, I do believe that it has a potential to negatively impact the doctor-patient relationship. And we can take, again, case studies from other jurisdictions where, it is physician-assisted suicide is legal. So, for example, in the case of the Netherlands, where doctors have an objection to assisted dying, then patients can be referred to these external committees of doctors who actually don't really know the patient, and so you're creating the situation where actually there is no proper doctor-patient relationship that's based on trust, on continuity of care, which we see in the UK, and which really should be fundamental to any kind of end-of-life care. And we're seeing that being eroded in other parts of the world, and there is a real risk that that would then impact the UK as well, and we do really have to be very conscious of that.
Jonathan, do you want to respond to anything you've heard before we'll take questions from our audience?
I think there's an overwhelming desire by patients to have it, and that's why it's so important that religious and medical leaders respond sympathetically. It's not going to be for everybody, but I can't see any reason why those people who wish it and who fall into that very narrow category of terminally ill, mentally competent, and doing so of their own will, why we would deny them that right if they so wish. I mean, whose life is it? Whose death is it?
Have we got any questions from our audience? Any issues that we haven't yet touched on that they'd like to fire away? Like I said, either feel free to put it in the chat or just a wave on your turn on a video and you can ask it directly. While we're waiting, I have a question for Jonathan or for Liz. You'll be aware that about 6 years ago, this same issue came up and an almost identical bill was debated in Parliament and fairly comprehensively defeated. What's changed since then? Why are we relitigating the same issue when our elected representatives a relatively short time ago seemed to have settled the question in favour of not changing the law?
Well, Liz can add her reply, but I think it's primarily because I think there's been a shift, and we're actually in the middle of this sort of tipping point at the moment. Until recently, it was complete taboo for religious leaders to be in favour. Now there are many religious leaders, not all, but many who are in favour. There's been an enormous shift amongst politicians as well. And there is increasing demand for the population. Plus, of course, all the other thing is the practical reality. I mean, forget the theory. The practical reality is that the current situation is a bad situation. Because if you are dying in pain or in dignity, or you're facing something awful, you've only got 3 options, and they're all bad. One is to carry on suffering. Another is to commit suicide yourself, not an assisted suicide with life-ending medication, which either gets botched and therefore leaves the person in a worse situation, or is successful, which is then horrible for the relatives. And the third option is to go to Dignitas, which, to pick up Sarah's point, is very much exclusive only to those who are wealthy, who can, and also they have to do it earlier than they would otherwise do, because they have to be well enough to travel aboard. So those are all bad options. So it's a matter of, I think, an awareness that the current status quo is not sustainable and needs changing.
Sarah, do you agree that anything substantive has changed since we last debated this issue in 2015?
I think social media has increased since 2015. I think whilst the doctors' vote yesterday, it was won to go neutral by 4 votes of an enormous electorate. I don't really see that as a big shift. I just see that as that particular debate and how that went. And actually, I think that sends out a really clear message that doctors see this as an incredibly complicated issue, and that there's a real diverse of opinions, because we recognise that it's really, really difficult. And yeah, that media has changed, and that society is increasingly, we value autonomy, that we're all these islands, and it's all about ourselves, and I'm not sure that's a healthy move. I really, really see at the end of life that real value in changing relationships, in having an opportunity for people who've been the carers to be cared for, to be loved, for people to have different priorities, to their priorities move away from working, from achieving things, to the relationships, to just being with people. I think the discourse in the media, on the internet, it's a lot more selfish, and I think that's quite sad, and I think that's where the religious argument still has a real place.
Any responses to that, or any other thoughts on what Sarah's just contributed?
Something that perhaps is important is recognising how the last 18 months has changed all of us through COVID. And it feels like, if we think about, one of the most powerful collective rituals that happened last year was the clapping for the NHS. And, we all know some of the criticism that was associated with that as well. But, I think there is this real need and opportunity for us to look at the spiritual and this care for our soul and care for our bodies and minds together. And Sarah said that she'd love to see churches talking more about death, and I think that there is the UK perhaps is fairly unique in the role that the NHS plays, and the place it has in people's hearts. And it feels like there is an opportunity to, as we eventually come out of pandemic, to be looking at, well, actually, what is important to us? What are our values? How do we want to live? How do we want to die? What does it mean for how we care for each other? And include this question of assisted dying for the terminally ill as one part of a much broader conversation, which it feels has been lifted in the sort of public consciousness through everything that we've all been through the last 18 months.
Thank you. Hina, did you want to chip in on that?
I just wanted to add a couple of points. So we have, over the last century or so, seen a real shift in the way that we approach death and dying, in the sense that, people are living longer, and infant mortality, for example, is reduced as well. So previously, death and dying were very much part of early life experiences, and they aren't anymore in the same way. And so that creates this fear and anxiety around death and what it means, and how people will experience it, and the suffering that comes with it. And, in the last 5 years, as Sarah alluded to, we have seen this acceleration of social media and other media reports, which may have shifted the debate slightly, but it is ever so slight. But I think it goes to speak about a larger issue around, social attitudes and perceptions around death and dying. And I do hope that we do have more conversations around all faith communities and none around death and dying and what it involves, because I think that will help make people make a more informed decision around these issues.
We've had another question come in, which is asking about what the impact on palliative care, which is often in this country has often got quite a kind of religious foundation. There's quite a lot of hospices with religious backgrounds. Do you think kind of legalizing assisted dying would have an impact on the kind of people and the places that are currently offering palliative care because of that religious tradition and heritage? Sarah?
Yeah, so if you look to Canada, where assisted dying was legalised recently, initially it was thought that places of care would be able to opt out of assisted dying, and so I think hospices who felt like that, and hospitals who had religious foundations or any other reason, felt secure in that. But actually the law there has been incrementally changed, and not just for this, for multiple reasons, and so hospices are obligated to do it now. So I think there is a definite tension and fear amongst hospices, where they're worried that, and it's, you know, it's yes, hospices originally came from kind of a religious movement from Christians, but that you know, there are plenty of non-Christians working in hospices who still don't want it. And there is fear and concern that they would be forced to do it, because, you know, for a lot of people it makes sense that it kind of all encompasses the care of the dying person, would include the time of the dying person's death, and that they would be the most experienced people to be doing that. You know, fears around creating a postcode lottery where, you know, if you live in one area and your hospice does do it, but another area where your hospice doesn't do it, again, that's not fair. It's not fair if people can't access it. And then from a religious point of view, I think I used to work in an area where a large portion of the population weren't Christian. I think maybe this is an opportunity for Hina to come in as a Muslim. I think there's still really big opportunities, and I think hospices are realising this, where they were traditionally Christian, people from other faiths didn't see that as a place that they were welcome or that they would want to die. There's still lots of work around being able to reach different communities for really good end-of-life care.
Do we need specifically religious end-of-life care? You know, a Christian or a Jewish or a Muslim hospice, some of which will not offer assisted dying, and some of which a more secular one, for which it's on the table? Or do you think that kind of fragmentation is really unhelpful?
I think there can be advantages and disadvantages. It will be certainly for a lot of Christians, they love it when they discover I'm a Christian doctor. You know, if when we're talking about the spiritual side of dying or living, in fact, is often discussed with patients. If they when it comes around to it, if they mention they're Christian and it is appropriate in conversation, I will let them know that I'm Christian, and they can find real strength in that, knowing that I'm caring for them with my knowledge, but also coming from the same faith perspective, just is a great reassurance. And patients will ask you to pray for them if they know that you're Christian, and it can be part of providing holistic care. So there can be real advantage in faith-based institutions. And I think if we look to the school sector, Christian schools still remain incredibly popular. And I think it's because their ideals, their values are really quite clear and aren't prone to changing societal attitudes. They're there. They're thought about. They've been inspired by God, by what's written in the Bible. So you know what you're going to get with them. And I think actually even patients who aren't religious, they have a trust in Christian doctors. They know that we are driven by a love for our care for the patient, a love for our neighbours, so they may still want to go to the hospice where they know there are Christians. There are some GP practices out there that have only Christian GPs, and I can't speak for other faiths. And I think Hina would be a good one to come in from the Muslim perspective, because I'm sure I'm fairly certain that Muslim patients really, really appreciate having someone of the same faith to care for them, because again, it's just that really understanding where they're coming from, being able to support them in a real holistic way. Whether it will fragment care, whether it's a disadvantage, I think if it means that there's an unfair balance of finances, of resources, if it means that patients aren't able to access good care, because you wouldn't want a faith-based institution not to have people and not faith, because that would, and I can't really see any faith-based institution doing that. They would always, I think all faiths would open their doors to those not of their faith to care and love for them. But yeah, there is that potential for fragmented services, as we already see in the NHS, where if we fragmented services not through faith but through semi-privatisation, that it can always cause logistical problems.
Jonathan, is it important to you that if assisted dying does come in, it is offered in this kind of universal pan NHS way, or would you be quite relaxed about it being a kind of devolved, and if a particular institution had a particular perspective and didn't want to offer it, that would be fine? Do you have a perspective on that issue?
All the hospices I go to are sort of non-denominational hospices. I mean, or they may have been Christian-based, but it's almost religion. Your religious tradition is irrelevant in the sense that you're treated exactly the same by the nurses, the staff, the doctors, we're all equal in death. So I'm not sure if I'd want to sort of almost ghettoize different groups into different hospices, and if it does become legal, then I wouldn't be pressing for a Jewish hospice, because I think that just like we have hospitals that cater for everyone, I think the hospices already do that and will continue to do that.
Any last thoughts? We've come to the end of our time. If any last questions or a final thought, otherwise I'll draw it together. Great, looks like we've covered a lot of ground. Thanks so much for everyone taking part. I want to thank our panel, Jonathan, Sarah, Hina and Liz, for your contributions, often appearing at quite short notice, so I'm grateful for that. As Ruth mentioned at the start, there's loads more information on this story and other stories that affect religion on the Religion Media Centre website. Got fact sheets and analysis and comment, so please do check that out if you haven't already. And otherwise, stay connected to the RMC. We'll have another Zoom briefing next week. But apart from that, I wish you all a good afternoon, and we'll see you again soon.
Right. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.